All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to have you all join. It's going to be a fun hour. My name is Alex, and I'll be moderating this. I am the VP of Technology at Unlearn.ai, where we have developed novel machine learning techniques to create digital twins of participants in clinical trials. Unlearn has hosted some past endpoints webinars discussing our technology, and you're free to listen to those. But today we want to do something a little different. We want to talk about the data that's out there in medicine and the data that's really the fuel behind any machine learning advance. And, to kind of set the stage, in the past year, ChatGPT has taken the world by storm. This has brought, a new sense of urgency and energy to finding new applications of generative AI. And a natural place to look is medicine. But past revolutions in AI have failed to translate into the same impact in medicine. And why is that? Well, a big blocker is the fact that, AI in medicine has been limited by the access to datasets. You just can't apply the same technology that powers ChatGPT because ChatGPT is trained on the whole internet. And finding that equivalent dataset in medicine is just not possible today. And just for some, it's not that it's just not possible, it's not accessible. For some reference, Wikipedia is about 20 gigabytes of data. That's one of the things ChatGPT trains on. And it's estimated that a similar amount of text is generated every year in electronic health records. But that data is not out there, not available for use, and instead has to be, specially curated by people that have had the foresight to work on this for years. And today I get to present two pioneers in medical data, the Critical Path Institute and CoreVitas. Both of them have been at this a long time. They were out there collecting this data, not at all with the intent for machine learning. And so they'll tell you why they started and how it's kind of adapted over time and how it's being used today. Interestingly, they have a lot of parallels of some ways that they use the same data, but then they also have very different directions and different applications for it. In particular, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Klaus Romero, who's the Chief Science Officer of Critical Path Institute. He's been there the last 16 years, during which they've had an exponential expansion of the amount of data and open up many new applications for this data, and he can talk through some of its particular uses in drug development. I'm also joined by Dr. Jeffrey Greenberg, who is the Chief Medical Officer at CoreVitas. He has also been there 16 years, which was a fun fact I learned. And also, and similar, had a large expansion of the growth of the size and diversity of the data. But they have a different use case, helping people run comparative effectiveness studies. So we're off to, we'll have a fun hour. We're going to do a few slides as an introduction. And then after that, we're going to kick off a discussion. And you all are free to submit your questions. And I will do my best to incorporate that into the discussion. So without further ado, let me pull up our slides. All right. Klaus, take it away.
Right. So thanks, Alex, and thanks everybody for the participation and the invitation. So as you mentioned, this is about data sharing and data integration beyond clinical trial data sets. And I made the point of emphasizing this because for the kinds of solutions to accelerate drug development that we're known for, we can't build those solutions on clinical trial data sets alone. So let's go to the next slide. Right, so just to level set for everyone, this is who we are. So Critical Path Institute is an independent nonprofit that was incorporated back in 2005 in direct response to the Critical Path Initiative document from the FDA that came out in 2004. This document has been updated, but even the original form of the document from 2004 is a really visionary document, and it calls for some pretty important aspects: public-private partnerships, data integration, data sharing, and significant quantitation on those data to address bottlenecks in the drug development process. We were created to help materialize that vision. So what we do is we provide the scientific infrastructure, the legal infrastructure, and the regulatory infrastructure to create a unique neutral environment where pharma companies, academics, patient groups, and other government agencies can come to that neutral environment and share information that they would not be able to share otherwise. A lot of times that information takes the form of patient level data from many different sources. So let's go to the next slide. This is the growth in how we have been able to integrate patient level data sources and non-clinical data sources as well at the subject level, whether animal models or in vitro experiments. But you can see that the scale of the slide doesn't really do it justice, because we're approaching 700,000 individual patients from clinical trials from industry, observational studies from academia, patient registries from patient groups, and electronic health records. We started with only a few thousand patients from a few clinical trials, but now we have an explosion over the last 5 years in data integration, and that is fantastic across close to 40 therapeutic areas. But we can't do this just by the fact that we are a single entity. We need the partnerships, because the data contributors need to find a place where the data can be leveraged, not just for the sake of data, but for the sake of building those solutions that can transform drug development. So let's go to the next slide. And so this is the process. So it goes from the integration of multiple data sources to a really sophisticated way of curating and managing those data, to then make sure that the data are speaking the same language, and that ergonomic and regulatory grade data subsets can be built so that actionable solutions for drug development can be generated. And that's the key to the puzzle of making sure that you can attract data contributors to share data. It's not for the sake of sharing data. It's for the sake of the solutions that can come out the other end through our collaborative approach. Let's go to the next slide. This is the conclusion. I have a plug for ACOP, the American Conference of Pharmacometrics. It's going on as we speak. I was there yesterday, and we had an extensive conversation about data sharing and data integration. I encourage you to look up the American Conference of Pharmacometrics. They really care about the entire landscape, from data integration all the way to solutions. Thanks, Alex, and I'll pass the ball to Jeffrey.
All right, Jeff, your turn.
Great. Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Klaus. That's really enjoyed hearing more about that. Alex, we can jump to the first slide. What I thought I would do is share a little bit of the history of our data, our company, and ultimately our founder, Dr. Joel Kremer. So Coravitas was originally Corona prior to 2019, and Joel had the vision that there needed to be a new and different way for doing phase 4 studies and post-approval registries. And to understand why this was necessary, you have to kind of think back to 2001 when the company was founded, and understand that that was when anti-TNF biologics were first coming to the market for rheumatoid arthritis and then other indications. And there was substantial concern, real concern, about the long-term safety, real-world effectiveness outside of a controlled population, immunogenicity of these drugs, switching between these drugs. It was really unknown. And each pharma company had proposed to run their own single-arm drug registry, or do a phase 4 study in some cases. And I think what Joel and the academic rheumatology collaborators that he worked with realized was that this wasn't an efficient or transparent solution. Really, a better way to do this was what was going on in Europe, where there were national associations launching disease-based registries, where there would be a single study, a single registry, and each pharma company could then query that data. And that's essentially what Joel proposed for the US for the first time. And in this model, instead of each company running their own phase 4 study or registry, Correvitas would be running a multi-drug registry, collecting data on all the drugs, and they would then be able to access this through Correvitas or Corona biostatisticians. Next slide, Alex. Thanks. And so fast forward 20 years, you can see that this model has kind of been replicated across multiple specialties, across 9 different disease registries. And we're now collecting data actively across 500 plus sites. We've got over 98,000 patients across these diseases, and we've got important partnerships with our not-for-profit patient advocacy groups, spanning rheumatology, dermatology, gastroenterology, and neurology. Next slide. And while this wasn't really, contemplated at the outset, it became clear over time that pharma companies really valued our approach, valued the rigor of the data, and they started to ask us to nest long-term post-authorization safety studies within these disease registries. And so over time, we had always collected safety data, but the rigor with which we collected and verified and validated the safety data grew over time. And as a result, we've nested post-authorization safety studies for our pharma clients for both FDA and EMA post-marketing requirements in rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, IBD, atopic dermatitis, and a few additional indications are in the pipeline right now. Can jump to the next slide. So really what differentiates our approach to real world data, which really is very different fundamentally from EMR data and claims data, is that our data is collected prospectively according to a written protocol with structured data that is required to be collected by physicians. This approach is really kind of fit for purpose for certain medical conditions and diseases, but not necessarily all. In some cases where laboratory data is kind of the outcome of interest, like a hemoglobin A1C or lipids, you may not need this prospective data collection. But for a lot of the autoimmune conditions with composite endpoints that include physician assessments that are not typically done as part of routine care, prospectively collecting this and including those validated clinical trial endpoints in a routine care setting is really what differentiates what we do. And of course, we also collect PROs along the way. And then finally, another key differentiator is we actually ask our physicians, investigators, to actively assess for safety endpoints between visits. And so it's not whatever happens to be written in the EMR note, but really they're actively assessing for a list of serious adverse events and adverse events of special interest at each interval. And this approach has been accepted by FDA and EMA as the type of approach for a prospective registry to meet regulatory requirements. So, and this has supported these post-authorization safety studies, as well as a lot of medical affairs, HEOR projects. And then finally, licensing this data in select settings where there is unique capabilities, expertise, or linkage to other data sets that is something that we would not otherwise be doing. So back to you, Alex, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to take a couple minutes to also introduce Unlearn and let you know where I'm coming at with my questions. So at Unlearn, we create digital twins of clinical trial participants. And a digital twin forecasts the future clinical outcomes in a trial. And so here's an example. This is supposed to be a pretend Alzheimer's patient. They come in, they get a battery of tests in an Alzheimer's trial. And our digital twin allows us to forecast what would happen to them. And how this works is the baseline data is collected like usual in a clinical trial. We then run that through our AI model. And this AI model has been trained on massive amounts of past clinical trials. And so we are very grateful for all people that have collected that and organized that and shared that. And then this is what powers us to make predictions into the future for these the upcoming visits. And at the end of the day, the trial runs as usual. A patient is assigned to be in either the treatment or the control. But we can make predictions for everyone as if they are in the control group. And this unlocks, new different ways to run clinical trials. So previously, you just have your treatment and control. And now we have a digital twin for everyone in this trial. And this opens up, new avenues of comparisons. Everyone has their own forecast as if they were in a control group. And you can use this to adjust the forecast prognosis can be used to adjust during the analysis. And this is what we call a twin RCT. And this new randomized controlled trial, you can increase the speed at which you can run the trial, or you can, boost the power and make a more effective decision. And behind all of this is a massive amount of data. So today we have about 670,000 patients that we're still working to process in about 33 indications. We have already spent a lot of time and we do a lot of detailed harmonization and quality control checks to process about 170,000 patients in about 9 different indications. And this has led us to today we have 7 released digital twin generators. And primarily in CNS related indications, but we recently released our Crohn's disease model, and we have more coming in I&I, and also we will be breaking out into new therapeutic areas in 2024. All right, feel free to check us out for more details. But now let's get into the fun discussion. So we set the stage. We heard a decent amount about the history of the data. I want to turn this to you first, Jeff. What do you think has been the biggest change you've seen over the last 16 years, and especially like how you thought data was going to be used 16 years ago, and kind of what you're seeing today?
You want to start?
Sure, Klaus, you can go ahead if you would like to lead off.
Sure. So one key thing that I've seen evolve is the fact that when we started this, we focused on clinical trial datasets because that was the identified type of data source that could support the generation of the first solutions that we had in mind. We were told back then that you could never entice industry to share patient level data. Well, we proved them wrong, the detractors. If you ask the industry scientists, they cannot wait to share. But they have to go through a legal process in which the attorneys have some anxieties about data sharing. We had to adapt our legal process to cater to those stressors and make sure that we understood where they were coming from. And so that's kind of a big change that I've seen, where now it's more of a natural thing for you to see that industry is willing to share data. That's the first thing that I saw change. The second thing that I'm seeing a significant change is that the voice of the patient is really taken into consideration nowadays, not just for the development of medical products, but for the development of the solutions that can remove bottlenecks in the process. And a key message that we have heard loud and clear, and it's now a really materialized message, is that the participants in research want to have the power of their contributions maximized in their utility. And so they're very strong supporters of data sharing. Of course, they care about data privacy and data security, but their main drivers to make sure that their data are maximized in their utility. There's other changes, but I'll leave it at that. Jeff, go ahead.
I would agree, Klaus. And just to add, from my perspective, probably 15 years ago, there was so much enthusiasm for what EMR data could bring, and big data in healthcare, and just put it all together and bring the best, most advanced, analytic approaches, and we will solve all the issues. We will have answers to all the questions we need. All you need to do is get the data and have your data scientists work at it. And I think what we've learned is that there is tremendous value to EMR data, and certainly to large claims data as well. But there is an increased sophisticated understanding of what fit for purpose really is. Fit for purpose depends on the use case. It's not generic. Fit for purpose is not fit for every purpose. And I think FDA and EMA and regulators around the world are now providing greater clarity around how real-world data sets outside of clinical trial data sets can be leveraged, under what circumstances, under what conditions, where it is optimized, and where, for example, where you need prospective data collection versus retrospective. And I think that clarity and that sophistication it took more than a decade, but now I think there is that clarity and sophistication, and so there's more efficient and optimized use of all data sets today than 15 years ago.
Yeah, the story of you just kind of build it and it'll magically come doesn't usually ring true, right? Personally, I don't know if it's true, but my general intuition is I would guess that if you don't put in the effort, you probably have to have hundreds of times the amount of data than if you actually focus, put in the data, find the right data at the right time, and that high quality data set really pays off. One thing I wanted to incorporate a question that came in from the audience. How has the landscape of the data changed over the years? Were you focused, initially in the US only? Have you seen a broader interest across the whole world? How has that changed in the last 15, 20 years?
Well, so what we always started with a global perspective, because given as we started with clinical trials drug development is a global enterprise, and the trials are run globally. So that's kind of the first component of the global landscape. As we moved into observational studies from academia, patient registries from patient groups, and electronic health records, we've also approached it from a global perspective from the very beginning. And there are specific therapeutic areas where you can only get those data from global sources, tuberculosis being an example that we have worked on. But so the data privacy regulations have evolved, and our processes have adapted accordingly. And there's the big push to find the right balance between addressing the need to have proper privacy and data security regulations, but also not stifle the call from the patients, which is very clear. We want our data and our contributions to have maximum utility and not have our data points live and die with a primary analysis of a single study. So that provides the substrate for an evolving conversation about how to strike the balance between the two. I'll leave it at that. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, from my perspective, working with pharma over the last 15 years or so, initially I was very surprised at how US-centric the interest was, frankly, for real-world data. From a regulatory perspective and a regulatory lens, there really is interest in each geography having representative data wherever possible. So certainly European data for EMA, US data for FDA, and of course, Japanese collected data for PMDA and so on. What we've also seen, though, is that regulators would prefer a well-designed, robust study over having inadequately powered, poor data from their local region. So there have been situations where EMA has accepted US-based studies to support their requirements for a pharma company. And so at the end of the day, high quality research is the priority, but geographic representation is always preferred, if that makes sense.
Great. Yeah. So this kind of sets the landscape for something, a question that came in from the audience, which is on, rare diseases. How do we think about, standardizing and sharing data sets in rare disease? How does that, open up, new challenges to how do you, get that right amount of data? And is there a different, sense of the trade-off between what patients are willing to share and pharma's feelings on that? Maybe I'll send that back to you, Klaus, first.
Yeah. So the rare diseases represent a big chunk of the future for medical product development for a number of reasons. They provide substrate for the evaluation of cell and gene-based therapies, which is the new frontier in drug development. I prefer to call them opportunities. They provide opportunities to think differently about the concept of the totality of evidence to demonstrate efficacy and safety for medical products. And they have a very engaged set of communities with those lived experiences. The one effort that, and again, this goes out to credit for the FDA. They came to us in 2019 with the notion of setting up a data and analytics platform dedicated to accelerating drug development for rare diseases. That is now a reality. It's called it's a long name, so bear with me. It's the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator data and analytics platform. The short abbreviation, which is in short, is RDCA DAP. You can contact us, and I'd be happy to put you in contact with the folks that lead that effort. And that provides a really nice interface for researchers to be able to access the significant amounts of data that we have in rare diseases. The other thing is that in rare diseases, there's the opportunity to have as many cross learnings as possible, because there are biomarkers that can have a meaningful application across many rare diseases, also clinical outcome assessments that could be learned from across many diseases. And there's the other aspect of identifying and understanding sources of variability that drive heterogeneity, even in small populations in rare diseases. That's where the opportunity lies. And there was a question in the chat, if I may, about real world evidence. So the FDA is very much interested, and so is EMA, on figuring out how to best apply real world evidence for drug development. One exciting case, which is in rare diseases and leveraged RDCA DAP, is the recent approval in February of this year for the first disease-modifying therapy for Friedreich's ataxia. In that particular case, the sponsor ran a trial, and the trial showed a difference between the treatment and the control arm. But there were additional questions that needed to be answered in order to further support the final decision. So what happened was that through the data that we have in RDCA DAP, which is significant, with patients with Friedreich's ataxia, the sponsor was able to access the data and deploy a mechanism to extract matched controls that could augment the totality of evidence, and that was used to support the ultimate approval of that first drug. It's a significant case study, and there's a lot of learnings to be had from that example. And we're happy to share the learnings from that journey with RDCA DAP. I'll leave it at that. Jeff, go ahead.
Thanks, Klaus. I think you've summarized a number of the issues really clearly. I would just add and echo what you said about, for rare disease, the need for collaboration. The economics for a single drug company to do everything for that rare disease can be challenging for that drug company. And the ability to leverage existing data sets, networks of physician specialists, novel approaches for external comparator arms, synthetic control arms, novel approaches to supplement clinical trials, make them more efficient. Alex, much of what you're doing with the digital twins, I think those are all needed to make headway for rare disease. Cell and gene therapies are extremely promising, especially gene therapies for many of these rare conditions, but the economics are going to be challenging, and consortium models, different approaches. We have one model that works in the conditions that we're in. It's certainly not the only model for collaboration, and certain rare diseases have existing disease registries that have had decades of investment that can really be leveraged.
All right. Thanks. So I want to take a slightly different direction. So I got a question from the audience about what are our thoughts on synthetic data in life sciences, and what are the current guidelines today, and how do we think that may or may not be used in the future?
You broke up on my audio for the last part of the question.
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question. So what are the thoughts on synthetic data in life sciences today? What are the current guidelines, and what do we think uses today and maybe uses in the future for synthetic data?
Yeah. So I'll start with a very candid message. You've seen how organizations like the ones represented today have been able to integrate patient level data in a really unique way from many different data sources. Okay, that speaks to the power of data sharing, the sharing of the actual data. There is a concern, which is not an invalid concern, that synthetic data could be used as an excuse to not share the real data. And I think we need to work in a coordinated fashion to make sure that that doesn't become a reality, that doesn't become the excuse, and that we dispel the fact that it's also a bit of a potential boogeyman, and we dispel that very clearly. So that's the first thing. The second thing, the FDA has put out guidance on external controls, and that speaks to, like the Friedrich taxi example, like real controls from another source that you can leverage and include in a submission package. But that also speaks to, Alex, the work that you guys have done with synthetically generated potential controls. That represents a major opportunity as well, but the devil's in the details. And so the question that really matters is, how can you adequately represent through synthetic data the real population? And if it's in a control arm, in a lot of, getting back to rare diseases, the notion of the untreated population. And not only the untreated population, but in diseases where the placebo effect really matters, if the synthetically generated data actually adequately capture the placebo effect in terms of the onset, the magnitude, the duration, and the variability. And that requires a really open conversation about what's under the hood and the matching and representation of the synthetic data against the real data. So that is a ripe application for artificial intelligence in drug development. There's many others, but this is one that really matches a lot of things that have to do with patient-focused drug development, clinical meaningfulness, artificial intelligence drug development, model-informed drug development, complex and innovative designs, etc. So that's the view that I would put on the table. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, and I want to just add one thing there, that we at Unlearn have spent a lot of time figuring out what are the FDA guidelines, what are the EMA guidelines, and how can you fit in, artificial intelligence in those guidelines. And that's where we spent a lot of time, that you can have this innovative AI, but what really matters is that context of use. And thinking really, really hard about the right context of use, making sure you can validate that context of use is super important, especially as we advance and think about different use cases there. All right, I'll turn it back over to you, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm certainly not an expert at synthetic data and the many challenges that the industry is facing. But I think, just to echo what both of you have said, which is the need for validation of kind of the specific ways that synthetic data would be used, particularly for regulatory use cases, being able to demonstrate, validate it, prove it, that it is, that it kind of meets all the rigor, the scientific method rigor that is required. Once you've done that, then I think you've crossed a major hurdle. So guidance documents is super helpful. And then I think demonstration projects would be super helpful to build so that folks would embrace it rather than be fearful of it or have concerns about it. You publish some studies, you have some real scientific data that non-AI folks can understand, like me, that then would allow folks to embrace it more broadly, I think.
All right, so we have another great question from the audience, which is, there are these long-standing comprehensive population healthcare databases. One example that was thrown out is the Comprehensive Healthcare Index in Scotland. These are millions of patients over 50 years. We're just trying to catch up to that. So what's the difference? Why aren't we all just using that? Why are we putting in this extra effort to collect this other data? We'll go back to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, you can't rely on a single data source, however big it is. Especially if so one of the key tenets of being able to develop these quantitative solutions that truly accelerate drug development is that you need to understand disease progression, but you also need to understand the drug effects. And you need to understand the control arm setup, including the placebo effect. And you need to understand clinical trial relevant aspects like dropouts. What is the time varying probability of patients dropping out from trials, and what are the drivers? For the placebo effect piece and the dropout piece, you cannot rely on, as big as any data source might be in the real world or an observational data source, that information won't be there. So that's the information value question number one, the answer number one. Number two, for disease progression, sure. Observational studies, registries, electronic health records, etc. But here's the rub. You need to connect that with what matters for drug development. And a lot of metrics that need to be used in clinical trials are a lot of times either not even captured in daily clinical practice or not recorded in very big single payer data systems. So that is a challenge with the information value. And then the third piece is the fact that you really need to have the ability to include those data sources, any data source that you integrate, into regulatory submissions. One of the challenges to this day is that some of those single payer systems have a provision, which is, a well-intended provision, that data redistribution is a no-no. And so far, the inclusion of those data sets in regulatory submissions would constitute data redistribution. We're actively working with a few of those systems, not the one in Scotland, to make sure that we work with them to change that provision and adapt that provision so that the data can also be put in front of regulators as part of regulatory submissions. So I'll leave it at that. It's the aspect of data quality, information value, and as you said, Alex, the context of use statements.
Well said, Klaus. I would just echo your comments about the disease-specific outcomes that are not necessarily part of these amazing Scandinavian data sets or Scottish data sets. They're not going to have the PASI score for psoriasis or the EASI or SCORAD scores for atopic dermatitis. So to know whether or not the drugs are effective in the real world, most of these larger systems would rely upon persistency on drug as a surrogate. And while that is, one surrogate that's been used, really, if you want to understand outcomes for cardiovascular disease, maybe these systems do certainly capture serious adverse events, hospitalizations like heart attack, stroke, death, certainly blood clots, etc. But when you want to study more domain-specific outcomes that require clinician assessments as Klaus said, they're usually these sophisticated metrics are missing from EMR data sets, or they're sparse. One doc does it routinely because he's a clinical trialist, and the other 95% of docs do not. They record that the patient is doing well, occasionally has some pain in this joint or that joint, and you're kind of left with the inability to truly quantify the outcome. So it really depends upon the disease. I think there really is a lot of opportunity for certain diseases where acute hospitalized events are the outcome of interest.
Yeah, that's definitely something we've noticed. Wide variance between different indications and how well like an electronic health record matches what you actually do in a clinical trial. Like Alzheimer's disease is something that's out there. The cognitive assessment you do in a clinical trial, I doubt anyone's ever actually done and recorded like in an electronic health record. All right. I want to kind of shift the discussion. Let's talk about what's going to happen over the next 15 years. So I'd love to kind of like speculate a little bit more about the future. Here, what are some trends that you see that you project will continue to grow? We've already talked about rare diseases. What else haven't we talked about? What's going to be, we reconvene in 15 years. What are we going to be excited to talk about?
Yeah, okay. In the spirit of playing with the crystal ball, certainly the growth in their significance of real world data and real world evidence, especially because of the importance of rare diseases in the future of medical product development. So that in itself is going to be significant. And that actually links to the question about large data sets that already exist. Because the more we proactively work to structure the prospective data generation to capture those things that actually matter, not just for clinical practice, but also for medical product development, is going to be pretty transformational. The complete rethinking of what constitutes the totality of evidence for efficacy and safety, especially when you have challenging rare diseases with opportunities to have gene and cell-based therapies transform the lives of those individuals. But importantly, in terms of data, I see a lot of interest in digital health technologies and decentralized trials. And the pandemic was like a boost for that. And it has been embraced in many therapeutic areas. And I think that is going to continue to grow. But that comes with an opportunity to really think about the types of, first of all, the size of those data and the opportunities that come with the integration of those data. But the rich information value that come in those data sources. And that also provides an avenue for artificial intelligence to find a well-placed use case, because you need to process those data in a way that provides AI with an opportunity to be able to extract meaningful metrics from the raw unprocessed data from those devices. That's what I would see in the crystal ball, and I'll leave it at that. Jeff, go ahead.
I'll take a slightly different tact about what excites me and where I'm hoping medicine will go over the next decade or two. And I think it really relates to precision medicine. And we're, outside of oncology, there's very little precision medicine in medicine today. And unfortunately, and it's not for lack of trying, but I think that there is so much to be uncovered within a phenotype of a disease about the underlying physiology, pathophysiology, or endotype, as they say, where you really understand the mechanisms or the shared features of a subset. So, for example, rheumatoid arthritis is not one disease. It's really a clustering of diseases that have a similar phenotype, but the underlying biology, depending upon whether it's an anti-CCP driven or not type of disease and the genetic interplay, they're really a mix of diseases. So I think in 10, 15, 20 years, having the right data sets to understand what's driving subsets of these diseases will enhance clinical trials, because you'll be able to have more efficient clinical trials that have higher response rates when you have a more homogeneous population and a targeted drug that really targets the right targets. And then being able to predict for the patient sitting in front of you, well, which mechanism, which endotype, which subset does this patient belong to, and select the right sequence of therapies for that patient. And I think we're starting to see glimpses of that. Cipher Medicine has developed a tool to predict who will respond to an anti-TNF biologic. Others have been able to start to understand interferon signatures in lupus and others. So at least for immune-mediated diseases, and probably more broadly outside of oncology, I think there's a lot of promise, but you need the data and you need the biologic samples to be able to unpack all this. And I think AI really will have the sophisticated tools to make sense of some of these complexities, or that's my hope.
I want to kind of follow on that. Do you think we could see a future where, the data that's collected in clinical trials and in, real healthcare settings kind of blurs together? Does it become like one where, if you need this detailed information to do precision medicine, do we close this gap between the two? Or do you think we'll have these like distinct pathways of like how we treat patients in a hospital versus how we treat them in a clinical trial?
Well, I think with the blurring of the lines, even in the US, between the discussions about efficacy and safety for regulatory decision making, and the discussions about effectiveness and risk for reimbursement decisions are getting blurred progressively. And that requires also a bit of a paradigm shift in thinking about this notion of what's the totality of evidence. And the more you get into the real world data pieces, real world evidence, external controls, whether real controls or synthetic controls, decentralized trials, all those things are going to force a rethinking of the entire paradigm, anchored on the needs for the products and the patients, right? Because if you have potentially transformational gene therapies, and you need to introduce the therapies very early in life to, in a classic sense, see the clinically observable benefits only years, if not decades later, then that begs the question of how do you set up the evidence in trials for that? And you can't do the classic, let's run a 30-year clinical trial. That's absurd. Nobody would pay for that, and you would lose all the participants. And there's all kinds of ethical barriers to that as well. So that the need for answers for new products can really transform lives is going to force that conversation. We have the pieces kind of out there, but the conversation about the patient needs and the technologies that are coming is what's going to force that change. And that comes with the change of the thinking about data sharing, et cetera. Jeff?
Yeah, I agree, Klaus. And I think that cell and gene therapy kind of post-approval requirements, these 15-year follow-up studies, um, they really do kind of shout for the need for observational studies, not kind of a classic clinical trial paradigm. Um, and and by the way, we should be following these patients probably longer than 15 years to really see what happens after that 15th year. They're gonna end up having no follow-up. So I think that in an ideal world, and I think Amy Abernathy has done a nice job kind of describing this vision where patients could and should be enrolled in a registry over the long term. And they can cycle in and out of a clinical trial here or a clinical trial there. And that clinical trial could leverage data from their participation in the registry before and the EMR data sets that can be fed into that clinical trial. And so there could be an ecosystem where for an individual patient, they participate at some stages in an interventional control trial. And in other stages, especially for rare diseases where you really want to take advantage of every patient and what happens to them, especially ultra rare disease, be able to follow them after the trial and maybe into the next trial and see what happens. So I do think that there's increasingly opportunities to blur the lines while maintaining the distinct differences that a control trial and randomization offers, which is unparalleled still.
Yeah, and I think that kind of also changes the view too of like, if you're a participant and imagine, I want to get some sort of personalized medicine. Like I would be more willing to hop in and out of these trials if I'm collecting that data that's also helping inform my decision sometimes. Sometimes I'm in a trial, sometimes it's helping my medical care. And it seems like there's a great opportunity to really shift the view of who these trials are for and how they get used, how that full information gets used. All right, I'm going to one final question. We're going to close it out and just kind of talk about. We had a great practical question. I want data. Where do I go? And maybe we can just kind of. We only have like a minute, so maybe we can just kind of close it out with some of the top choices or like how you'd approach that problem of finding the data you need.
It goes back to the question: what question are you trying to answer?
Mm-hmm.
And what's the context of use of the solution that you need? That's the fundamental thing. What question are you trying to answer? And then that should dictate what kind of data you need. But then there's a challenge. The F in fair for data sharing. Where to find the data. I think we can fundamentally do better as an entire ecosystem to have the different data sets be findable. I just typed an answer with info@cpath.org. Feel free to follow up with us. I can't promise that our data are going to be the answer to every single question, but we're happy to describe what we have in our data that are accessible. And if it helps answer a specific question, great. And if not, we at least can point you in the direction of other data sources that you can try.
I think, Klaus, you summarized it well, that the data really, where you go for the data depends upon the question and what is really fit for purpose for that research question. I think there are a range of solutions and consortia and opportunities that within each disease, there are solutions. And there's not one solution across all diseases. Really, right now, there's clusterings around different organizations.
All right, and I think that's a great way for us to close it out. Hopefully everyone learned a little more about data. You're all excited. You want to apply, machine learning or some analytics. And I think it's a great way to end it. You need to really think hard about how you want to use this data, what you really want to get out of it. and then invest the time to really understand what's there and get the answer you need. So thank you all for coming. Thanks, Klaus and Jeff, and see you all later.